Right, good morning, grade 11s. Let's carry on with lesson 3 of gaseous exchange. Okay, so let's go. We got as far as the thoracic cavity. And the thoracic cavity or chest cavity is the airtight box, and that airtight is terribly, terribly important. If anything happens to actually pierce the thoracic cavity wall, and the first aid students will know this, Ethan, you'll know this, if an individual is stabbed into the thoracic cavity, and so there's an opening from the outside, then that patient will actually not be able to breathe, because every time they expand their rib cage, air is sucked in through the little opening that has been caused, say, by the knife, and not sucked in the correct route to go into the lungs. So it is airtight. It houses what is called the bronchiole tree, the lungs, the heart, and other structures such as the esophagus, but we're not concerned with the other structures. Let's just talk about this term bronchiole tree. So the bronchiole tree is the air passages down which air or through which air passes when it goes into the thoracic cavity. And that consists of the trachea, the two bronchi, the bronchi that divide into smaller bronchi, and they continue to divide and divide and divide and form the little tiny, tiny bronchioles. And we'll talk about that in more detail later on. The tops and the sides of the thoracic cavity are formed by the ribs, obviously the sternum and the vertebral, the thoracic vertebrae you learned about in grade 10, and muscles which lie between the ribs. So between two successive ribs, there are two sets of muscles that join those ribs, and they're critical in the process of breathing. They're called intercostal muscles, and we'll talk about them in more detail when we talk about breathing. So when a person eats spare ribs, what they're doing is they're eating the intercostal muscles, the muscles between the two ribs. Right, the bottom of the thoracic cavity is formed by a dome-shaped sheet of muscle and connective tissue called the diaphragm, which is pronounced diaphragm and spelled diaphragm. Right, and then the walls of the thoracic cavity or the chest form a protective cage around the lungs and other contents of the chest cavity. Now, by now you should know in life sciences, you shouldn't just say protect, because what does that mean? Does it mean protect against the mafia? Does it mean protect against falling concrete blocks? Or does it mean protect against ultraviolet radiation? What is meant by protect? You've got to be specific. And so here you would say protect from mechanical damage. Okay. Right. Starting off with the structure of the trachea, because that's how far we got last lesson. And the very top part of the trachea is called the larynx. And it tells you at the bottom here, don't worry about all the labels on these diagrams, because the function of me putting in these two diagrams was just to show you the structure and the position of the larynx. Remember that the larynx is the Adam's apple, so it's what one feels vibrating here when a person talks or hums or whatever. And the larynx contains the vocal cords, so they're essential for sound. And we'll talk about that. So here we've got the larynx. It's a really big piece of cartilage. At the top of the larynx is the epiglottis. We spoke about that yesterday. And then here is the rest of the trachea, held open by means of little C-shaped rings of cartilage. Let's look at the right-hand side drawing. Nasal cavities and mouth both lead into the pharynx. Here is the epiglottis. And here is the larynx. Okay, the vocal cords obviously are not going to be visible from the outside. In order to be able to see the vocal cords, one needs to have a special instrument that goes down into the trachea and looks at the vocal cords from the top to be able to see the vocal cords. So let's have a look at what the next slide says they look like. All right. So it tells you that the vocal cords are two flexible bands of muscle tissue, and they sit at the entrance to the trachea. So they're within the larynx. So this would be looking down into the larynx. And these vocal cords are relaxed and the individual is not speaking. And these vocal cords are closed, and this would be when an individual is speaking. So let's have a look. You can look down into the trachea here and you can see the rings of cartilage. And here the vocal cords are contracted and together. And when sound is pushed upwards from the lungs, when air is pushed upwards from the lungs, the vocal cords vibrate, and it is possible then to emit a speech sound. Okay. Right, so a reminder from the digestive system, quickly going through the epiglottis, a flap of cartilage located in the throat behind the tongue in front of the larynx, usually upright at rest, so it's standing up like that. Like the open lid of a pedal bin in the kitchen, and it allows air to pass into the larynx and the lungs, and air to pass out of the larynx and the lungs, and the larynx, and be exhaled. Remember that during swallowing, the epiglottis folds down like the lid of a pedal bin to cover the entrance of the larynx so that food and liquid don't enter the trachea. Because if they did, so here the trachea is called windpipe, just to make you aware of the fact that this is a common name, but you're not allowed to use a common name. You've got to use the scientific name trachea. Okay, and after swallowing, the epiglottis returns to its original upright position. Okay, right, so this is an actual photograph looking down at the epiglottis. The vocal cords, please, there's no H in chords. Okay, musical chords has an H, not biology chords. Here's the opening to the trachea, and here's the opening to the esophagus. Okay, so let's have a look at the rest of the structure of the gas exchange system of the human. Okay, so the trachea, commonly known as a windpipe, but you're going to call it a trachea, is a tube made of a sort of membranous tissue. In a human, it's about 12 centimeters long. So if you consider your long ruler, the one that you draw margins down the side of your exam paper, and divide it into 3, it is slightly more than one of those thirds. Okay, it's attached to the larynx, so the larynx is the top part of it, and it lies in front of the esophagus. Okay, so remember the esophagus lies directly behind it, and when you did the digestive system, you learned that when the food is going down the esophagus actually expands into the trachea. So this is a trachea. What you can see here is, okay, you can look into the trachea and you can see that there are rings of cartilage. Those rings of cartilage are not complete. They always referred to as C-shaped rings of cartilage, and those rings of cartilage do not close at the back. So they only go that far and they don't close at the back. So the back part of the trachea is just the membranous tissue. There's no cartilage in the back part of the trachea. So the cartilage rings hold the trachea open, or else air would not be able to pass through the trachea, either going to the lungs or back from the lungs. The function of the fact that they're not complete rings of cartilage is that it's to enable the esophagus, which remember lies behind this. So in the human, the esophagus lies directly behind this, it enables the esophagus to be able to expand. And they always say into the trachea, but it's not into the trachea. It just pushes the little membranous part of the back here inwards into the trachea so that the food can pass down the esophagus. So the cartilage rings reinforce the trachea and prevent it from collapsing during inhalation. The posterior wall of the trachea has no cartilage and contains this elastic ligamentous membrane. That is a soft membrane. So here you can see larynx, trachea, and then the trachea branching off into the two bronchi. And in a cross section, this is a cross section under the microscope of an actual trachea. So here's the lumen of trachea, and here's the little soft membranous part at the back, because the cartilage ring is just for the C-shaped section. The back of it doesn't have cartilage in the wall of the trachea. And then here's the esophagus. Oh no, good heavens. Yes, here's the esophagus. Sorry, I was reading that label until it went down to the esophagus. So here's the esophagus, which is obviously a soft tube structure. And so when the esophagus expands, when food is going down it, it'll push into the trachea as it expands. Okay, all right. So that's the trachea. All right. At the lower end of the trachea branches into two what are called bronchi, plural bronchi, singular bronchus. So there is a right bronchus and a left bronchus. One bronchus enters each lung in the little concave section of the lung that is actually called the hilum, H-I-L-U-M. We're going to talk about that a little bit later on when we talk about blood vessels. And the bronchi have complete cartilage rings. They're not C-shaped. They go all the way around the bronchus, which is very logical if you think about the fact that the esophagus doesn't lie behind the bronchi. And so it's not necessary to have the little C-shaped ring. They can have the complete rings. And the bronchi branch and branch and branch and branch and branch and branch until eventually they're so tiny that they don't have cartilage in their walls. And those little tiny structures called bronchioles. So there's a bronchiole, and there's a little bronchiole. Okay. And each bronchiole ends in a bunch of tiny little air sacs called alveoli, singular alveolus. And this is where the exchange of oxygen and carbon dioxide actually takes place. And there are hundreds of millions of alveoli in a pair of lungs. So if you look here, here's a little bronchiole. These little structures here are smooth muscle bands, not to be confused with cartilage rings. Because in a bronchiole, remember by definition, there is no cartilage. So they branch and branch and branch and branch until they're so tiny. And then eventually each little bronchiole ends in a cluster of little air sacs called alveoli. Plural, alveoli, singular, alveolus. And then what you will see is that there's a branch of an artery. So remember that you should have learned in grade 10. Arteries divide into smaller arteries, which divide into even smaller arteries, and those very small arteries are called arterioles. And so this would be an arteriole, which then divides into even smaller blood vessels called capillaries. And every single capillary is completely surrounded by every single alveolus is completely surrounded by a network of capillaries. And the blood in that arteriole, very unusual, because arteries normally carry oxygenated blood. This is deoxygenated blood. It's an artery because it's going away from the heart towards an organ. So by definition, it's an artery. But it's unusual in that arteries normally carry oxygenated blood. These arteries or arterioles carry deoxygenated blood because they're going to the lungs to pick up oxygen and get rid of carbon dioxide. And so as the capillaries pass over the surface of the alveoli, you will see that they become increasingly more oxygenated. And then the little capillaries join together and form venules, and venules join together and form bigger venules, and their veins, and they leave the lungs and go back to the heart to be pumped. Again, very unusual. This blood in a vein, normally veins don't carry oxygenated blood, but these little venules do, because they are coming back from the lungs towards the heart, and therefore they would have gotten rid of their carbon dioxide and picked up oxygen. Okay. All right, so what are lungs? They're large, they're sort of cone-shaped, they're very elastic, and they fill most of the thoracic cavity. I'll show you a picture just now that shows you in between the two lungs is a little cavity in which the heart is situated, and I'll show you a picture of that just now. The right lung is a little bit bigger than the left lung, and the reason for that is because the heart is situated towards the left side of the thoracic cavity, so it's slightly left. It's not exactly in the middle, and so there's less space on the left side of the thoracic cavity than there is on the right side of the thoracic cavity. So the left lung smaller than the right lung, and the right lung is bigger. Okay, so right lung 3 lobes, left lung 2 lobes. There's a very thin membrane which is attached right on the outside of the lungs, and there's a second membrane which lies lining the thoracic cavity. These two are called the pleural membranes, pleural spelled P-L-E-U-R-A-L, and there's a little space between them filled with pleural fluid, and the membranes and the fluid that they hold reduce friction during the breathing movements, because every time an individual breathes, the lungs move, the rib cage moves, and then the lungs move. And so there's a potential to actually have friction between those two surfaces. So the pleural fluid reduces that friction. Okay. All right. So going back to the lungs, remember I said to you that they are sort of slightly concave in the inner surface, but other than that, they're more or less cone shape. And that little inner concave section is called the hilum. Here's the spelling of the word hilum, H-I-L-U-M. A bean also has a hilum, the kidney also has a hilum, so it's a little concave inner section. Right, so a pulmonary artery from the heart enters each lung at the hilum. Just next to where the bronchus enters each lung. Pulmonary artery, I said to you, carries deoxygenated blood, in other words, blood that is rich in carbon dioxide, low in oxygen. And in drawings, they're normally indicated as blue, obviously. A pulmonary vein leaves each lung at the hilum, that little concave surface near where the bronchus enters, and the pulmonary vein carries oxygenated blood, rich in oxygen, low in carbon dioxide, and it's normally indicated as red in the drawings. So that's what you can see here. All right. The pulmonary artery divides and divides and divides and divides in each lung, I told you, and eventually forms smaller arterioles, and eventually so tiny that it's a capillary network surrounding an alveolus. And then the capillaries join together and join with other little venules to form the pulmonary vein leaving each lung. And it's terribly important that you remember pulmonary artery oxygenated blood, pulmonary vein. No, let's try this one again, because I've just said you need to remember and I've messed it up. Pulmonary artery deoxygenated blood, unusual. Pulmonary vein oxygenated blood, unusual. Okay. So here it shows you, remember that this is the right lung because you're looking at the individual. It's not you, it's the individual. Okay. So the right lung bigger than the left lung. It's got 3 lobes. Left lung only two lobes. One lobe, that top one, and the second lobe. And you can see that the left lung is smaller than the right lung. And that's not just because the front of the left lung has been taken off. Obviously, that would make it smaller. And here's the heart in between the two. And you can see that the heart is slightly towards the left side. Okay, it's not exactly medial, slightly towards the left, which is why the left lung is smaller than the right lung. So this shows you human lungs with a heart between them. The color is not a good indication of the color that the lungs would normally be. So because the lungs contain a large supply of blood, lungs are actually normally quite dark red in color. Those of you who were dissecting lungs at open day this year will remember the dark red color of those lungs. Okay, now we're going to talk about alveoli. The walls of the alveoli are made of a single layer of very flattened squamous epithelial cells. Remember you learned about squamous epithelium last year? And you learned that squamous epithelium is the flattest epithelium. So walls of an alveolar, single layer of squamous epithelium. Now, you can call it squamous, you can call it squamous, I don't care. Just make sure that you can spell it correctly. There are lots of different pronunciations. Okay, I told you that each alveolus is surrounded by a network of capillaries. So what you need to think of is when you go past a person at the robot who is selling avocados. So they've got a bag of avocados, and that bag is made of a green network of nylon, and the avocados are inside. Now that network of nylon around the avocados is exactly what that network of capillaries looks like. All right. The bronchioles, remember, terminate in this grape-like sac, cluster of sacs known as the alveoli. There are these little capillary networks that surround them. And so between the air in the alveolus and the blood in the capillary surrounding the alveolus, there is a single layer of squamous epithelium from the alveolus wall and a single layer of squamous epithelium from the wall of the blood capillary. So only two layers of very, very, very flattened cells separate the air in the alveolus from the blood in the capillary. And it's only about 0.2 micrometers distance that those two layers together. So only about 0.2 micrometers separate the air in the alveoli from the blood in the capillaries, because the walls of both structures are really thin. Okay, actual gas exchange takes place only in the alveoli. So oxygen is absorbed from the air and goes into the capillaries. Carbon dioxide passes from the capillaries into the air in the alveoli and is breathed out again. Okay, gaseous exchange does not occur in the bronchi, the trachea, the bronchi, the bronchioles, only in the alveoli. There are about 300 million alveoli in the two adult lungs, which provide a surface area of about 160 square meters. So almost equal to the singles area of a tennis court and about 80 times the area of the skin of a human. And you don't have to know that. It's just to give you an idea of the actual, how big they are. Right, so I showed you that before, and I'm not going to go through it again. So this one in cross section or longitudinal section shows you, here's the wall of the alveoli, or in this case it's one alveolus. So one alveolus, two alveoli, three alveoli. And you can see that it's a single layer of epithelium that forms that wall. Squamous epithelium, really, really, really thin. And then the blood capillaries surround the alveolus, and the blood capillary wall is also made of a single layer of squamous epithelium. So there are two layers of squamous epithelium, one from the alveolus, one from the capillary, and then there's the blood. So here's the air that's been inhaled, there's the blood. So gaseous exchange occurs really rapidly between these two structures because it's a very short diffusion distance. Okay. This is what, this is a falsely colored electron micrograph that shows the alveoli, sort of a purple color, and then the capillary network surrounding the alveoli. Unfortunately, in the breaking and the making of this actual micrograph and the cutting of the tissue, etc., you can see that many of the capillaries have actually broken, but it does show you how extensive the capillary network is. So if you look here, this is very much like this drawing that I showed you, but this is a drawing that shows you in 3 dimensions a section through an alveolus. So there would be air in here, and there's a blood capillary, and there's a blood capillary, and there's one, and here's another alveolus, and here's another, and another, and another, and another. And it shows you how thin the layer is between those two, between the blood in the capillary and the air in the alveolus. And then this is just very typical lung tissue under a light microscope, and it's been stained. So this then would be like an arteriole or a venule. It's not a capillary because the capillaries are so tiny you can't even see them. Okay, so there's a scanning electron micrograph of 2 alveoli, 2 complete alveoli, 1, 2, and then little blood vessels between the alveoli, little intersections between the alveoli. You can see single layer of squamous epithelium, really, really thin walled. Okay, so pathway of air. Air enters the body through the nose. It is warmed, it is filtered as it passes through the nasal cavity. And I mentioned in yesterday's lesson that the nasal cavities have got the 3 turbinate bones in each nasal cavity that divide the nasal passages into really each one into 4 separate passages. Okay, so just consider it like a set of shells jutting out on the side. As air passes the pharynx, which has the epiglottis that prevents the food from entering the trachea, it passes into the upper part of the trachea, which is the larynx. It passes through between the vocal cords, and it moves into the bronchi, which carries air into and out of the lungs. So we're talking about inhalation here. Okay. If you have a look at this, then the air passes into the alveoli. So it would go into this alveolar space. This is enlarged. And it takes about 1 second to pass through for gaseous exchange to occur. So to go from oxygen to go from the alveolar airspace through the squamous epithelium layer of the alveolus, through the squamous epithelium layer of the blood capillary, into the blood. It takes approximately 1 second. And as the blood passes the alveolus, it becomes nearly fully saturated with oxygen and loses its excess carbon dioxide. So as this is happening, oxygen is going in that direction, carbon dioxide is going in the opposite direction, because remember, each gas diffuses from its area of high diffusion pressure or higher concentration to the area of that gas's lower concentration. So oxygen is going that way, carbon dioxide is going back again. Now, when we talk about the blood being saturated, blood can only contain a certain amount of oxygen. It's never 100% oxygen. It reaches a saturation level, okay, and loses its carbon dioxide as it's going past. So this just shows you, here's an alveolus. Air is passing into the alveolus. It's air rich in oxygen. Remember, it's not pure oxygen, it's air rich in oxygen. So the air here would be rich in oxygen. It's showing you the direction of blood flow, and that's important if you get a drawing like this in a test or exam. Look at the direction in which the blood is flowing. And what is happening is, as the blood flows past the alveolus, carbon dioxide is diffusing from the blood into the alveolar airspace, and oxygen is diffusing from the alveolar airspace into the blood. And so the blood becomes increasingly more oxygenated as it moves past the alveolus. Okay, so there is an animation. You can copy and paste that link and go to the animation that shows you breathing and gas exchange. Right, then this is your homework for the day. So you are to answer questions 1 and 3 on page 214 of your textbook. That's today's homework. And remember, I will release the answers in about 2 days' time. Okay, so here, what you can see is, you can just see it's a very, very magnified section of this is the air in an alveolus, alveolar air, and this is a capillary going past, and it's showing the direction of blood flow in that direction. And what you can see is carbon dioxide is diffusing from the blood into the alveolus, oxygen diffusing from the alveolus into the blood, and so the blood is becoming increasingly more oxygenated. Okay, that's enough for today. Remember, learn the work every day. There's a lot of terminology. There are a few definitions. You must know the work